building suspense.
So I'm going to interrupt Dave's talk here. Hi, Dave.
Oh,
Dave didn't know I was going to do this, but was at home looking after family on Wednesday. So Dave has put many years into SID PHP, and he's recently taken the step to spend more time with family. So we presented this to Dave on Wednesday, and I may have had a little last night, but other than that, Dave, this is a bit of a thank you for the many years you put into SID PHP and the community in Sydney, and best wishes and well health to the family.
well, thanks very much, Jack. Oh. Derek Reithen would be proud. There we are. A fine Glenfiddich. Thank you. Cheers.
I don't know how I can follow up from that. Yeah, it's sort of been said, hasn't it?
Well, another's always good.
Yeah, sure, I'll just pull that out of my... Cool, okay guys, so we've got a talk now, and then we're going to split up for afternoon tea. So yeah, that's basically what we have. We still don't have any takers for the umbrella and the headphones. There's no one that's arrived since we tried to give these to their owners. No. Someone's going to come and take them afterwards. They just don't want to admit it. I don't know. I'll take the headphones. They're kind of cool. Okay, cool. Okay, so right now we've got Dave Clark. Dave, for those of you who don't know, used to do all the Sydney PHP stuff up until very recently. You're the technical director at Formation. And yeah, you provide training, a lot of stuff to do with Zen certifications and that sort of thing. And you're going to be talking about stable applications with PHP and third-party services, which is a really good roll-on from the last talk, actually, as it happens. Funnily enough. Isn't it funny how conferences work like that? Guys, welcome Dave. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, folks. So with my first act of getting up here, I'm just going to check to see if that's working there. That will be the mute button. There we go. Hey folks, so can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, all right. Great, well just before I kick off, I'd actually like to do a few thank yous of my own. Now, obviously, I was taken a bit by surprise there by Jack, but I have to say that as far as community goes, over the last year and a half, Jack himself has actually been absolutely fantastic to work with and has been one of the main reasons why we have had such good years and so on and so forth. But yeah, he's shaking his head up the back there. But fun conference earlier this year, a lot of the organization was actually down to him. So thanks to Jack for that. Thank you. And I suppose one good question to ask everybody is, how are you enjoying the conference so far? Yeah, okay. So from that point of view, there's a reason why that's happening as well. And of course, we've got a little bit of time to go before we get to the end. But this wouldn't be happening if it wasn't to do with Seb up the back there as well and everybody else who's pitched in to make it happen. So I just want to say a big round of applause there. Making this stuff happen isn't easy. It takes a lot of work, and really appreciate that. So back to stable applications with PHP and third-party services. Now, it's always a pleasure to hear Dustin talking through it, and he does go very, very quickly. That's one of the great things about having these videos and things like that to be able to refer back to, because it's a wealth of information to take in, a lot of really great stuff. And there are actually some similar concepts that I was going to be talking about here. What I'd actually like to do, on the basis that there were some topics that I was going to talk about too that Dustin ended up covering a little bit of, I'd like you all to come with me on a bit of a journey, right? So thinking about community, looking around here, I'm seeing lots of people who I know are smart people, lots of people who care about what they're doing, they care about quality, and coming out with an optimal solution, right? So just as a starting point, I wanted to work out how many of you are actually already heavily using a third-party service as part of your part of your current applications. How many people? Quick show of hands. Great. Okay, so maybe getting some quick shouting out. Maybe over this side of the room, someone want to tell us what service you're currently using? PayPal. Okay, so MySpace. That was you? Fantastic. What's that mean? So Stripe, yeah, absolutely. So we're hearing payment gateways here. Anything else? Maps, so Google Maps, yeah? And, oh, sorry, just 2 seconds. What was that mean?
Email provider.
And email providers as well, absolutely. What was the other one?
FEI.org.
Okay. Do you want to tell us a bit more about that one?
FEI organization, it stores all the horse race data from all of the world.
Well, that's important, Will. I recognize that accent. You're a fellow Scotsman, if ever there was one. Excellent. Yeah, so, and what's that mean? Identity verification, absolutely, right? So all manner of different services we're relying on more and more. And one of the things that Dustin mentioned was, he actually went through part of the thought process with us, right? He had the website up on the screen. He's talking about the overhead of implementation versus actually going off and starting to use one of these services. Now, with my role day to day, one of the things I need to consider as part of architecture, of planning for new projects, along with the development team as well, because look, it can't just be one person's decision. Just like we're all sitting here together, there's a whole lot of collective experience which you won't be able to tap into if it's just one person, right? So I think there's a lot of value in being able to discuss these things and talking about the pros and cons, and that's a little bit where this journey is going to go. Now, I've found that a little bit of planning can do a lot of good for you, but how can you do that if you don't know how to plan? So, when we're talking about stable applications, what does stable look like? What does it actually mean? So, folks, any ideas what does stable mean to you?
Resilient to failures.
Resilient to failures. Predictable.
My pager doesn't go off.
Your pager doesn't go off, Jack. Well, your pager always goes off, but we know why. There's a lot of dirty laughter. And it's getting worse. Well, the less we say about that, the better. So, when we think about what a stable application is, I figured it boiled down to these three things. I don't think this is anything that's new for anybody, but if we think about application environments, we'd expect the behavior to be pretty similar between environments. We wouldn't expect anything to just fall over because it's in one environment other than another. And if we change the infrastructure, ideally we should be in a situation where the application can still run. We don't have to re-engineer the code just because we swapped out something on the back end for something else. And then service quality. We want to make sure that that's acceptable. That's going to mean different things to different people, of course, because, what are we doing here? Is it just a simple, brochureware site, or are we talking about something that's highly transactional? All these things are different, and the importance, of course, is different to different businesses. For everybody, when it's their business, it's absolutely, it's critical that these things are working as well as they can. So when we think about service quality being acceptable, if we're going to test against that, we need to actually understand what those metrics are, what we're actually trying to achieve. Now, when it comes to application instability, what are some of the things that can affect that? Marketing departments. Did somebody say synergy? Oh. Users, absolutely. There's a problem, guys. It's between the keyboard and the seat. Yeah. What was that mean? Okay, sorry, I couldn't hear you. There you go. There's an abbreviation that I should have known, and I appreciate that you've now. A swear word in your. Oh, it's absolutely. I think we can run into those kind of situations day in, day out. Absolutely. What other things? Internet Explorer. Now, hang on a minute. I know I'm wearing a Microsoft T-shirt, and a pin badge that says Microsoft loves Linux. Where's Pierre? Is he here? Oh, okay. Look, I had to sidle up to Pierre and ask him very nicely for some swag, because you might have noticed my accent here. Well, anytime I go along to a conference, I'm always keen to get as much swag as possible. With an accent like this, the only thing that ever comes out of my wallet is the occasional moth skeleton, so I'm quite happy getting as much swag as I can. All right, so some things that I was thinking about: tightly coupled and overly complex or simple code. So either side of the spectrum, that can cause some issues when you want to add a new feature or enhance something that's already there. What about dependencies on third-party software libraries or services even? Anybody had any difficulties related to dependencies in software? Any breakages? Okay, so a few people have got their hands up. I'm sure there's probably more than that. But thanks to Jordi going through Composer with us and those best practices, I don't think any of those will be related to anything to do with that. So the other thing is, when you've got application code which is uncoupled, but it doesn't necessarily deliver everything you need, these things can combine in order to provide us with an environment which is more open to the risk of application instability. So how can we start to promote application stability? What sort of things do you guys do? What does that mean? Automated testing? Automated testing. Anything else?
Regular load testing.
Yeah, regular load testing. Now, Dustin went through some very good information there showing us a lot of different tooling that we can use and bring into our build processes in order to get really useful information about that. And I think that's probably one of the biggest areas that we can benefit from focusing on. So from there, key things if we're going to be doing that kind of testing. But, even before we get to that point, if we're going to build something, think about getting into the right mindset before we actually go ahead and build something. Ultimately, as engineers, we're solving problems. We need to make sure that we properly understand those problems if we're going to provide a proper solution. And as time's going on, we're going to make mistakes. And it's absolutely vital that we do, and that we do it in the right place. So we shouldn't just be happy to fail. We should be embracing failure, because, aren't we glad that it happened now and that we found out before we spent however many hours, however many weeks working on this solution just to find this hidden challenge down the line. So you want to test? You're going to have to start with some very clear expected outcomes. Now, as time goes on, applications are evolving. Who's been working with an extremely legacy code base? Wow. And before anybody shouts, hey, PHP is pretty much old enough to get drunk in any state. Yeah, you're right. I was talking with Erasmus yesterday, and he said, yeah, just about 21 years, so yeah. So whenever you've got a new application, right, it's super easy to just keep churning out feature on top of feature. Real easy, right? The thing is, starts off a blog, and then before you know it, Frankencode. It's alive. That's actually all my own work. I hope you're suitably impressed. Creative Commons, go for it. So what we're faced with, and this depends entirely on where we're working, what teams we're working in, the constraints that we're up against. We've got to try and balance the perfectionist in all of us along with the pragmatist. Okay. So what sort of things do you think I'm talking about there? Any thoughts? This might be your life. Understanding MVP. Absolutely. Understanding MVP. How far is too far? Because you know what? Once you get started, it's real hard to stop, isn't it? Because you can go to the nth degree. You see this thing and it's like, wow, I really want to solve this. if I could just get it that little bit better, then wouldn't that be perfect? That's the sort of thing we naturally crave, right? But we need to, under certain circumstances, balance it up. We can expect over time we're going to find bugs in existing code, which we previously thought was fine. And we can expect that when we add new features, there are going to be new bugs introduced. By fixing a bug, we might introduce something new. Okay? When we have new requirements and enhanced functionality, we're going to have to go through a process of understanding what is MVP. And then also, along the way, if you've got legacy code bases you're working on, you've got to ask yourself, are the guys who are around me right now the same people who started on this project? Does anybody even know who they are and where they live now? Those people who started the project. These are all things that we can expect over time. So let's think about new requirements and enhancements for a moment. And let's focus on understanding the problems that we're solving. These two questions are kind of 4 questions, really. We're thinking about who's using the application and the feature, and what's the impact of using it, what's the impact of not using it. Because sometimes value comes from understanding what the downside of not doing it would be. Now, not everybody will be in a situation where they're kind of responsible for coming up with these, but if we keep that sort of product mindset, it'll become much easier to understand what we're doing and why, and then also think about helping to prioritize the value there, because that's something that everybody can bring to the table. Now, when it comes to the how-to aspect, we're going to have to go through a bit of a decision-making process. And this is the sort of thing that I end up having to do quite a lot. And as I say, it's extremely beneficial to involve other people in the process too. We've got to weigh up, is it the sort of thing that we should be building completely from the ground up, from scratch? Should we go off and identify a series of different services, maybe some libraries that already exist out there, and try and implement something with those? Should we do a mixture of those things? So how would you guys approach that decision-making process? What do you do for your personal projects? Do you think about these things at the moment? Maybe give me a little bit of feedback. What do you do?
Look at the risks of doing something, the risks of not doing something.
Yep, pros and cons, risks. Yeah, risk assessment. Wondering about what the problems could be if you'd go down one road versus another. What sort of risks do you think are attached to these things? So time, yeah, it could be very expensive. And
the library doesn't do what it was supposed to do in the documentation.
Yeah.
It's not partially implemented or something.
So you get so far with something and then realize a critical feature is not there when you expected it to be based on documentation.
You might be relying on a library whose roadmap you don't understand or know, and they might change tech no longer applicable to your problem.
Absolutely. So if you start using a library, is that library maintained? What if it changes direction? What if suddenly something that was very nice single-purpose components suddenly ends up with tight coupling through it that makes you require a whole stack of other stuff? Now, again, Jordi showed us some things that you could do with Composer in order to say that something's actually already provided manually. That's a workaround, something you can do, right? But it's a very real risk. Okay? Very much so. So, other factors that could affect the choice. You could be thinking, as we said, about cost of implementation, also the cost of any ongoing maintenance. You've got the flip side of that as well, where you're thinking about, well, actually, if we fail to implement this, what is the cost? And what's the cost of then, failing to maintain it properly if we do implement it? Other things that can affect us could be the specific business rules that are applicable to either niche industry that we're working within, the available budget, of course, and of course the timeline as well. So if you get a very, very strict timeline about when things need to be delivered, perhaps Maybe you're working in a startup environment and you've agreed some key milestones with some stakeholders where you're saying, look, we're gonna get this MVP out and we're gonna get it out by this time. And they say, yep, no problem. If you don't have it out by that time, then that's your funding gone. We're just gonna draw a line under it. So maybe those are the sorts of pressures that could push you towards one decision over another. Now, if we're gonna try and make some of these assessments, we're going to need to go through a bit more of a thought process, right? We've got to understand what we don't understand to some extent. Because if someone says, we need you to be able to build this and we need it within 2 weeks, can you confidently say you can do it in 2 weeks? Chances are, you probably can't tell until you start drilling into it a little bit more. And something I want to talk about a little bit is that process of trying to understand what you don't already understand. So how can we fill some gaps in our understanding? How do you currently fill gaps in your understanding? Someone asks you for an estimate. How do you go about giving it? Ask questions, yeah. Google? Yeah. Yeah. Taking that big problem, breaking it down into some smaller problems that are easier to manage. And in many respects, that's exactly what I want to talk about. I want to talk about how we learn from failure and adapt through a process which is called rapid prototyping. Does anybody actually do rapid prototyping right now? Few people, yeah? Absolutely. I can't recommend this enough because it's a great way of understanding exactly what you don't understand. By spending a small amount of time, by making a smaller MVP, you provide yourself with an opportunity to fail faster than ever because you've got a target that's easier to hit. You're able to very quickly prove a concept. Through that process, you get to understand the challenges. Those things that you wouldn't have got to until you were much later on, having already built half the thing, and then realizing, hey, we got another 2 to 3 weeks of dev time here. Okay? So this offers us an opportunity to quickly implement. And it also gives us an opportunity where we can get that information we're missing to make a more informed choice. But we got to remember that this is a rapid prototype. And what that means is we need to remember to stop. So how do we get ourselves to stop? We need to focus on what are we actually trying to achieve and what the outcomes are going to be. Remember, folks, from our conversation before, what are outcomes absolutely essential for? For testing? Absolutely. So for testing, we absolutely need to have those outcomes. So what can we do? We can start off by testing against expected outcomes and begin working with our test definitions. Now, one thing that I'm actually really pleased about is that when we started off this session, or actually just before we started it off, Dustin was talking a little bit about how you could incorporate tools like Grunt and Gulp into your workflow and what you're working with. Is anybody currently using something like Grunt to automate unit tests? Well, yeah. So a few people are. Yep, okay. Now, something that I started doing just recently that I quite enjoy doing for the likes of rapid prototyping exercises is to make use of Grunt and to set up kind of like a continuous pre-integration setup. So you come up with your outcomes, okay? You make your test definitions with those, and then anytime you're making changes to custom code, what will happen is that the changes will be detected, and then the tests will be run. So it sounds like it's a fairly interesting thing probably for most folks. Just to check, is it an interesting thing? Do you want me to go into it a little bit more? Yeah? Alrighty, cool. So the IDE that I've got up in here in the background is PHP Storm. And I'll make sure that this repository is available with some clearer documentation. Hey, left the documentation to last, eh? Wow. You can tell I'm a professional. So with regard to this, as you can see, I've got the terminal open at the bottom here in PHP Storm. And what I can do is I can run this command, grunt watch. Now, what I've got is on the left-hand side of the screen here, you can see I've got the folder structure of the application. Now, I do run workshops and I also teach classes for Zend, so quite often what I do is I supplement the Zend material with my own material. And this was for a class that we're learning about object-oriented programming, and it was for the first time ever learning about object-oriented programming. So I wanted to build it up from scratch. There are a lot of things as far as design's concerned in here that are deliberately not, great designs on the basis that it's good fun to actually discover those things together as a much more experiential learning experience. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see the different folders there that make up the application. Inside of the module directory here, I've got a stack of classes here that are all custom code, and I've got a test folder here, which is pretty much just mirroring that here. Now, I'm not going to spend too long on this, but just to try and give you the idea behind it, you can see down the bottom of the screen, after having run the grunt watch command, we're waiting for changes, waiting to detect changes. Behind the scenes, I've explained several folders that I want to be watched for changes. And I've also determined there's a specific task that I want to have run when changes are detected. And this is where, as I say, it becomes kind of like a continuous pre-integration. Let's have a look at this class that I have here. I've started with the test. This is following a bit of the TDD approach. So we've got the test here, and I've got a class that's going to be a calculator test. It's going to be a very basic example, just testing an add method, which doesn't exist yet. The calculator class doesn't exist yet. So the way I've got this here, I've got the namespace, I've got the class definition. We can see it extends the PHP unit framework test case. And for anybody who's less familiar with PHP unit, what you see here is a setup method and a teardown method. What happens is every single time a test is run, the setup is called first, and then the teardown is called immediately after. So every time you're running a test, you've got something to set it up for the test and then to tear it down right after. So that's what those are. And then further down here, I've got a method here, test can add results in correct sum. Now, I may choose to rename that because it may have made more sense to me at the time, and then after 2 coffees or 5, I might look at it again and say, actually, let's make that a bit easier to understand. But ultimately, we're going to test the add method. So rather than test can add, we would want to say test add, because maybe it's just an add method. So test add method results in correct sum. So I haven't actually saved the file yet. And you'll see that currently this says the test is marked as skipped with a message not yet implemented. Watch what happens when I save. Down at the bottom of the screen, it detected that there was a change, and it's now running the test. So I'm getting very immediate feedback as to whether or not the application is acting in line with expectation. Of course, right now, I don't have a test. Okay? I've just got something that's marked as skipped, but it's very easy for me now to go, okay, well, look, I'm getting ready to implement this, so I'm going to set that I expect the value 2, and the actual will be to go off and say this calculator and then add. Now, I'll put 1 and 1 in here for the moment. Now, it's going to fall over because there's a couple of problems, right? Number one, we don't actually have a calculator class anywhere, right? And there's no add method. So we can see the messages coming back here. If we were unsure about what's going on, it's actually fairly easy to understand. Hey, look, you had a call to member function add on a non-object there. Fair enough, right? Super easy. So what we're going to do now is come back up here. We've got calculator test for the test, and in the module folder, I'm just going to very quickly create a calculator class. So directory. Can spell calculator, which is very good. Very pleased with that. Okay. And I'm just going to call this one calculator.php. Right. Now I'm going to be super cheap and nasty and just copy some body from another one to speed it up. Now, I don't know if anybody else was super impressed with Ben's talk yesterday when he had that sort of self-writing code. That was pretty impressive. And anything that goes wrong with my machine now, of course, is entirely attributable to Ben's experimentation. So, okay, I'm going to copy something from the entity folder here. Right. So very quickly, what I'm going to do is just implement this class. And from here, get rid of all this. And I'm just going to make an add method in here. Okay, so we'll just have it return null for a moment while I get this sorted out. Now, the thing is, of course, what I've got going on here with the whole test running very quickly thing, you might be thinking to yourself, wow, that's a lot of effort there, you know, it's churning away through resource. Obviously, I'm not suggesting you run a whole suite of behavioral tests here or anything, but I'm thinking about very quick feedback on functionality every time you make a change. You can do it in just little increments. Again, we're not talking about testing necessarily a whole application, but giving you something that you then could import into the application and make part of a wider suite that could be run on build. And just the way I've set this up, you could set it up any way that suits your workflow. Right, so going from here, coming on down to the test again, so of course we're getting the warnings here, and that's because within the setup for this particular test, we're not actually doing anything to give us the object, so it will still be failing with the same one. So inside of setup, we can just say this calculator, of course, use the object operator, and we'll get where we want to be, and calculator. And of course, the namespace needs to change because being lazy, I copied it. So we want to make sure that this is now calculator. And then when we come to actually implement this other one, we'll just forget the fact that it was extending that guy. That's fine. And down here for the calculator test, again, the import statement at the top here will have the incorrect namespace. So I'll just change that over. And then from there, this is where a little bit of pure code review comes in handy. There we go. And there we are, right? Hey, thank you. So all green. So thing is though, but wait, but, did we actually test anything? Exactly. So before we get too excited and start popping the party poppers, let's go ahead and just check that our expectation is correct, which of course it won't be. So we've got our expected and our actual, and then on running it, we're getting a failure. This is what we want to be. We want to have this failing, right? So what I'm going to do, of course, is now implement this. It's going to be implemented in a very basic way, and of course, we can talk about ways that we would improve this right away. But if we give it parameter, we'll just say n1, might as well just point it out. If we had a little bit more time and we were doing this as a sort of TDD workshop, they would of course be saying, well, we recognize that this is a very poor way to do an addition. Wouldn't it be better to have an array of parameters, you know, and have it just add all of them, you know, rather than doing just two numbers, because we're really limiting our options, yeah? So anyway, that's part of the fun of doing this sort of thing. We can build on these things as we go. So what we'll do is we'll just return n1 plus n2. And bear in mind that if we were doing this as a real application, we'd be thinking, of course, about different things that could come up. What if we don't have a number? All those sorts of things. How are we going to handle that? Are we going to throw an exception with this on the basis we expected a numeric value to be provided? Those sorts of things. And then we can add those tests as well. Test it throws this kind of exception when you know, the wrong data type's provided. So, yeah. Fairly interesting? Yeah? Okay, cool. Well, what I'll do is I'll make sure that there's a few more instructions, and I might actually do just a very quick separate video walking through how the grunt file was set up, just so it makes a bit more sense. If any of you guys want to play with those sorts of things, well, hopefully something you wouldn't have had a chance to do before, perhaps you will feel more like it.
Can we see the grunt file?
Yeah, absolutely. So very briefly, there's grunt file here. The bit that you want to look at, and I'll go through, as I say, I'll do a separate video for this, and I'll make sure that there's a tweet about it with the information. But the idea is that you've got task configuration. We've got a task in here which is delta. It's actually an alias task. The comments explain why. And I've got something here which is PHP files. And I'm explaining from a separate configuration file what files I actually want to be watched. So I'm saying, look, the custom code files are this group of files. So there's an array of different directories saying, look, these are the directories where my custom code lives. For the configuration, likewise, and also for the tests, likewise, right? So the separate configuration file, which is the build config file, that's where I'm defining custom code test, and the global config. The more you start playing with something like Grunt, the more fun it is, and you'll be able to come up with more things that you want to automate. And yeah, seen lots of interesting things so far. And hopefully this whets your appetite a little bit. So the main thing is, by running the grunt watch command, it was then able to go through and check that.
How well does that play with the autosave feature that's on by default in PHP store?
That's a good question, actually. I haven't checked, but if it's modified, if it does an autosave, I'd be quite interested to see. I haven't sort of left it for too long. I'm usually going very quickly with the old control save, especially with that machine. Ben. Alrighty. So, any questions on that before I bring us back to the slides, folks? Any questions? No? Alrighty. Okay, so with that in mind, let's flip on back into the slides, and I'll pick this up where we left off. So I think there's just a few minutes left, and so I'll pick up from the current slide. So when we know the implications of implementing a feature, it becomes easier to provide better estimates, which then we can use to determine, with better information, can we actually do this? Should we do this? So let's imagine we were choosing to leverage a third-party service. We want to think carefully and ask ourselves these questions. Will the application break if the service fails? We've got to think about designing for failure, right? We want to expect failure. Everything that Dustin was saying, and everything we were saying before about making sure that the application's resilient to faults, that it can just get on with it, right? We want to design with that in mind. So let's go just one little bit deeper. The common things you would want to think about with third-party service risk is what happens, assuming we've chosen this third-party service provider, what happens if they go out of business? What happens if they deprecate the API we're using? What happens if arrangements for API access change? So commercial restrictions around things like rate limiting, those sorts of things. What about if it just costs us a fortune to access? All those things are things that can impact the business, so we've got to be careful about just rushing in there. So that's pretty much a good guide to keeping yourself right. So the main thing I was going to touch on here was the Netflix infrastructure in AWS and the Simian Army, but obviously Dustin's gone through that. The links that I used here are referenced in the slides, so I'll make the slides available. And beyond that, I just want to thank you guys for taking the time to go through that with me. Do you have any questions? Anything you want to share even? Any experiences with third-party services that have gone well? Any experiences that have not gone so well?
How do you do anything special with slow APIs at all? Do you try and do anything around that?
I think it depends entirely. So the question was, do you do anything with like slow API calls and things like that? I think that if you're in a situation where you can't get out of a long, a request that's going to take a long time, think about how immediately you need some data. It might be worthwhile actually just making one call at a specific point in time. How often does the data change, that sort of thing? So going through that usual process of when you're approaching something from a caching perspective, think about, is it better to actually just go and hit this API at one point in time when it's really quiet or whatever, grab the data we need when we can get an optimal response and just bang that into cache so it can be grabbed real quick in future. Yeah, good. Hey, sure.
Hiya. So in terms of writing tests and dealing with those external services, how do you test for or track any changes upstream in APIs? Do you keep your own tests and mocks against those, or are there other services that you can use, another third-party service, to track third-party services?
Yeah, I think it's one of those ones that's always going to vary depending on what you're actually trying to implement and what kind of service it is. But again, yeah, if we try not to generalize too much, I'm trying to see if I can give a very specific example. I'm conscious of time as well, but the main thing that I would suggest is if you can reasonably ascertain what a correct response would be that you're expecting, it should be fairly easy to actually just automate against your own API that's leveraging that and look at the data that's returned. That could be one way of doing it that's maybe not so intensive. If you're trying to do things in a very lean way and you don't want to necessarily have to stub, mock everything, et cetera, then that could be one way of doing it. Your API, you know what the response should be, so you test your own API against some expected criteria. What's the outcome you're expecting? And then if it's out of line with that, or if it's failing suddenly, then that's a big indication that there's a big, serious problem. Hey.
There's people that say
Some people say that you should log everything every query that you do to an API, and also log the answer to be easier to debug if you have any problems, which you will have eventually. Do you agree with that? Is that something that you?
It's a good one. I think that it would be useful, but it depends again on what you're actually doing. Okay, so when I say that there, I'm just thinking about an agency environment for a moment, because that's where a lot of the recent experience that I've had has been. We're in a situation there where the justification for spending time to implement something like that, can often be pushed back because the value of it is not immediately realized. It feels like we can rely to some extent on the benchmarks that some service providers have given. Oh, we're up 99% of the time, et cetera, and we'll know if something's failed. And it's usually fairly quick, because if we're logging at our end any failures, we can then take them to the provider and say, this is what I got. Yeah. So, depends.
Yeah, kind of the problems that we have, and I had in the past as well. Like not being able to provide some more information to the partner, what more debug lines on what's happening, and so they can help.
Absolutely right. Yeah. Alrighty, folks. I think that's us definitely out of time, but just wanted to say thank you very much indeed. Appreciate that, and I look forward to catching up with you guys a little bit later on. Yeah.